Hello, Tara here again. We're on chapter 24 of The Bridge to Belle Island. Um, we're having some serious flooding on the island, so circumstances are getting a little dangerous. Chapter 24. 2 hours later, the baskets had been loaded, and Mr. Grant had driven them to the Farringdons' barn for safekeeping. Their work party broke up, Jacob and Carlotta returning to the house, and the weavers and tenants leaving for their own homes. Roy Houghton leading Mr. Christie, while Evan Curtis disappeared over the bridge with the weavers. She was surprised he would leave his father, and Lottie, at such a time, and briefly wondered what he was doing. But soon more pressing concerns crowded out the thought. Mr. Booker remained nearby, gathering his discarded coats and wrestling them on again. When the wagon returned, Isabel was surprised to see Abel at the reins instead of Mr. Grant. As Abel neared, he explained, "Silas stopped to secure a room at the inn for the Houghtons. Roy's missus is poorly, as you know, and the tenant cottages are close to the water." She swallowed hard at the thought and made do with a nod. "He said he'd also make sure the boat was secured so it doesn't float away like so many have already." Good idea. Mr. Grant was certainly determined to help her. A bud of gratitude, of forgiveness, sprouted in her heart. Abel hesitated, puckering his brow uncertainly. He sent an uneasy glance toward Mr. Booker and lowered his voice. And I thought you should know, miss. I don't know what Evan is up to, but I saw him calling to some men in a sailing barge, that Redknapp fellow among 'em. They were trying to dock at Riverton, but the pier is under water." Isabel's pulse accelerated, and she and Mr. Booker exchanged raised brow looks. So, Enos Redknapp and his crew were still nearby. But why was Evan hailing them? She hoped he was urging them to leave. After Abel moved on with the wagon, Mr. Booker went indoors, saying he was going to warn Mr. Hardy. Isabel lingered outside, surveying the rising water. She watched the menacing flow with trepidation and saw the flotsam both Abel and Lottie had mentioned. Branches and rowboats driven loose from their moorings, and there, a bloated sheep. Ugh. Her stomach twisted at the sight. Realizing the tenant cottages might be in danger, Mr. Truelock came over to offer Mr. Christie the spare room in the vicarage for as long as needed. Isabel thanked him and returned to the house. Venturing below stairs, she found Mrs. Philpotts in a panic, she and the kitchen maid scurrying about with mops and buckets. "Water in the cellar and coming into the larder. Kitchen's next." Oh no. Isabel was torn. Did she set the servants to work on setting up barricades and bailing water, or did she send them to higher ground? She thought again of what her father had once told her, describing a terrible flood years before, when he and his parents had been trapped in the house as the water drew closer and closer to the doors. But the water was already in the house, at least below stairs. Did that mean this flood was even worse? What now? She could not bear the thought of damage to her beloved home, but she would not put anyone else in harm's way. "Mrs. Philpotts, please instruct the staff to gather their important possessions and go to their families' homes, or if they haven't somewhere else to go, to the inn in Riverton until the flood passes." "Are you sure, miss?" "Yes. Hurry." "And what will you do?" the older woman asked, concern deepening the lines on her face. "Don't worry about me. This is only a precaution. The house has withstood many storms and floods over the years, and will withstand this one as well, no doubt. But just in case, make sure everyone gets out." Isabel looked around the kitchen for her puppy. "Have you seen Ollie?" "Not in some time, miss. And what about our guests?" "Mr. Booker went to find Mr. Hardy, but I'll make sure everyone knows." Going upstairs, she stopped at the bedchambers one by one. She found Mr. Adair scolding his valet for carelessly packing, while at the same time urging him to hurry. In Rose's room, capable Miss O'Toole latched the final valise. "Where is Rose?" Isabel asked. "Said she was going to go look for the dog." "Good. Well, it looks like you're almost ready to depart. Thank you, O'Toole. Don't forget to pack her mother's jewelry, just in case." She turned to go, but O'Toole blurted, "I doubt I shall ever see you again, miss." Isabel started and turned back. Was the woman predicting her demise? "Of course you will." "I don't know. After my mistress marries, I fear she will want a more skilled lady's maid, or the Adaires will engage some fashionable French woman, and her voice hitched, I shall be dismissed." Compassion swelling in her breast, Isabel stepped nearer and squeezed the woman's hand. "My dear Miss O'Toole, Rose depends on you and has never said a word to me about letting you go. But you will always have a place here with me, should the need arise." "Really?" The woman's thin face brightened. "Thank you, Miss Wilder. That eases my mind." Isabel went next to Mr. Booker's room. The door was open, but there was no sign of the man. Mr. Hardy's room was empty too. From the end of the passage, she heard footsteps ascending the stairs. She followed them up one level, but found only the servants quickly packing their belongings. She heard a door slam and more footsteps. Someone had gone to the roof. Not Mr. Booker, she knew. Maybe Mr. Hardy went to gain a better view of the flood surrounding them. Not a bad idea. Isabel saw the young scullery maid struggling to carry her trunk and hurried to help her. Perhaps later she would go up there as well. Looking for Mr. Hardy, Benjamin stopped first in the study. Mr. Hardy's leather brief bag sat open on the desk, papers piled on either side. He'd been there, apparently packing in haste to leave, but where was he now? Benjamin guessed he had gone to his room to find something, or to begin packing there too. Glancing at the papers, Benjamin was surprised to notice several documents related to the Wilder estate piled within the bag, including the newer will Benjamin had found. His stomach dropped. An odd suspicion prickled over him, but he reasoned with himself. Mr. Hardy was only taking it for safekeeping, in case Benjamin forgot to pack it. Beneath these papers, a corner of what appeared to be a letter protruded, catching his eye. He bent to look closer and saw feminine handwriting and part of a St. James Square address. Curiosity overcoming concerns of privacy, he slid the letter out and saw that it had been addressed to Mr. Percival Norris. Benjamin had seen Miss Wilder's handwriting often enough since coming here to recognize it, on invoices and correspondence related to the basket-making business left on the same desk. Dread gathered at the corners of his mind. Benjamin unfolded the letter, planning to read only enough to assure himself his suspicions were wrong, only to find they were terribly right. "Dear Mr. Norris, I was very unhappy with your recent visit and your presumption in bringing a stranger to look over the island with a view to letting out part of our property. And by our property, I mean mine and Rose's. It is not your property to do with as you like. As trustee, you are only its steward, not its owner. Forgive me for writing so bluntly, and perhaps rudely. I have never raised the issue before, never felt compelled to remind you that though we are distantly related, you are not, in reality, our uncle or other such close kin. Yes, you have been granted some authority by my father, but with the intention you would facilitate his wishes for the estate and his heirs. He would never have approved of this latest scheme of yours. Leasing part of the island to a boat builder would have been bad enough, disrupting the osier growing and the basket-making industry we have started there. But after you left, I discovered that among my retainers is one who was acquainted with your Mr. Redknapp in the past, and knew him not as a boat builder or reputable man of business, but as a man with criminal connections who is not at all to be trusted. Perhaps I should give you the benefit of the doubt that you were ignorant of the man's reputation and dealings. It is possible that he hoodwinked and manipulated you as he had so many others, according to my friend. But I wonder, for I have grown increasingly concerned about your management of estate funds and some of the investments you have entered into on our behalf. Recently, I received a letter from a banker, an old friend of father's, who informed me that your latest venture failed at a significant loss. What you do with the stipend you receive as trustee is your own affair, but it is time to put an end to such risky investments with estate funds before we find ourselves bankrupt. At all events, you told me to reconsider Mr. Redknapp's offer, urged me not to make a rash decision because, as a sheltered, naive female, I did not know what was best for me in the island. I disagree. I have thought it over, and I do not grant permission to lease any land to Mr. Redknapp or to anyone else. And if you attempt to override my decision, insist that your authority as trustee usurps mine, then I will have no choice but to take steps to replace you as trustee, as perhaps I should have done years ago. I do not mean to sound ungrateful. After my parents died, you were helpful to me, and later to Rose. But in the intervening years, you have progressively overstepped the bounds of your authority, controlling more and more of our lives and financial resources, and ignored or even gone directly against my father's expressed wishes. This cannot go on. I am an educated, accomplished woman of 30 years. I am capable of managing my own affairs and providing any guidance Rose should need until she marries. I am also capable of convincing a judge of this fact if need be. Most sincerely, Miss Isabel Wilder. Benjamin was stunned, but there was no mistaking it. This was the angry letter Miss Wilder had written to Percival Norris, the letter Mr. Hardy told him Percival had destroyed. His mentor's explanation echoed in Benjamin's mind. He read parts aloud to me, then in his anger wadded it up and tossed it into the fire. Yet here it was, smooth and whole. Robert Hardy had lied to him. What else had he done? Suddenly, other moments and incongruous details began shooting through his brain like lightning strikes, one after another. Mr. Hardy smelling of citrus in the public house, which Benjamin had put down to a new shaving tonic or brand of tobacco. The old, stained gloves he'd worn that day. The stilted way he'd reacted when they first heard Mr. Norris was dead, compared to the very real surprise he'd shown when they learned he'd been struck. Then sending Benjamin away from the scene of the crime and trying so hard to shift the blame to Miss Wilder or Captain Curtis, anyone. Finally, showing up here with papers and poison? Had Hardy placed that poison in the cellar himself, determined to prove the wine had been poisoned on the island at any cost? Another thought went through his mind. Had the housemaid's death been an unforeseen second murder, or had Hardy some reason to think Mary Williams might have seen him in the house that day, fiddling with the bottles in the butler's pantry, so he made sure she was done away with? Benjamin shuddered and shook his head. Surely not. He could believe Mr. Hardy might hide an incriminating letter, but the rest? No. Even as he told himself, his imagination was getting the better of him. Long ago whispers he'd heard returned to him, about Hardy's father being a charlatan who cared more about profits than patience, who'd supposedly developed a popular elixir that left children addicted to opium, but him rich enough to buy a country house on a lake. Benjamin had always attributed the rumors to mean-spirited gossip, reasoning that even if there was a hint of truth to them, the claims were against Mr. Hardy Sr., not Robert Hardy himself, who'd wisely not followed his father's footsteps. Surely he could not be blamed for the sins of the father. But then again, as Ben's Welsh grandmother used to say, the apple does not fall far from the tree. No, there must be some other explanation. Folding the letter and newer will within a piece of sturdy parchment, he tucked them into his inside coat pocket and strode to Mr. Hardy's bedchamber. He found it empty, except for a valise waiting near the door. In the passage, he encountered Adair's valet, hurrying past with 2 valises and a hat box, and asked him if he had seen Mr. Hardy. Yes, sir. Saw him go upstairs. Said he wanted to look at the river from the roof. Benjamin groaned. Did it have to be the roof? He forced his feet up the stairs and pushed open the door. Robert Hardy stood at the low balustrade, the Wilder's field glasses to his eyes, aimed toward the southern tip of the island. The rain had stopped, a lull in the storm, though the skies were still gray and the air heavy with the promise of more rain to come. Hardy glanced over, then fitted his eyes to the glasses once more, returning his gaze to the river. Did Miss Wilder describe Redknapp Redknapp's sailing barge as having red-brown sails? The anxiety in the older man's voice gave Benjamin pause. Without answering, Benjamin looked out and saw a dark vessel rocking in the choppy water. Was Hardy worried Enos Redknapp planned to take another shot at him? Had Captain Curtis been right when he'd said that, with Percival dead, Redknapp had moved on to squeezing Percival's associates? Is that why Hardy had taken the newer will? To destroy it and guarantee his position as successor trustee, so he could deliver the island to Redknapp after Percival failed to do so? When Benjamin remained silent, Mr. Hardy lowered the glasses and turned to him again, his look of irritation transforming into something else as he studied his protégé's face. Awareness. A knowing. Benjamin took a shaky breath, his chest tight. Why did you do it? Do what? I read Miss Wilder's letter to Percival, the one you'd said he destroyed. Hardy glared at him. Why were you poking about my personal property? It isn't yours. Hardy shrugged. So I wasn't eager to have my firm's name blemished by sharing the contents of that letter. That isn't a crime. No, you lied to me. Hardy huffed. Yes, Ben, I lied to you. Welcome to the real world of adults. Sometimes we lie when we must, for the greater good. Remaining near the door, Benjamin recalled Hardy's long-ago advice once again. State what you suspect as fact with confidence, and 9 times out of 10 people will believe you in possession of the evidence and respond accordingly. Emboldened by it, Benjamin said, Percival's reckless actions were threatening your way of life, your reputation, and you could not stand by and do nothing. Hardy frowned. What are you talking about? I think you know, sir, and so do I. Ben made the mistake of glancing over the parapet and felt the world spin, but then he forced himself to hold his mentor's gaze, not to back down, not even to blink. If he was wrong, he'd be cut loose, unemployed. If he was right, it would be even worse. Hardy hesitated, perhaps weighing his options. Then his expression tightened into grim resolve. Percival was determined to destroy himself, and me with him. I have a daughter to think of, a grandchild, a well-known firm. I could not let him ruin everything I had worked so hard for, my reputation, my livelihood. I tried reason, pointed out all the ways he was endangering not only himself and the Wilder fortune, but also me and my family. I lent him money, helped him avoid the shame of bankruptcy, but he would not stop. Always one more deal, one more investment that could not fail, but always did. Hardy shook his head. When a pair of ruffians came to my house while my daughter was visiting, I knew I had to do something. There was no point in going after one moneylender or smuggler, for Percy would always find another, or they would find him. It was him I had to stop. Hardy sighed. I had thought we were friends. It is why I allowed him to retire quietly from the firm, instead of bringing his misdeeds to light. Surprise flashed through Benjamin. He was already involved in illegal dealings while a full-time partner for the firm? Yes, small infractions at first. Questionable business dealings that were not unequivocally illegal. A master of the loophole was Percy. I thought I was doing him a favor by not revealing his wrongdoings. But now I see that left unchecked, his deeds only worsened. Why did you not go after him legally? You know why. A big scandal like that would destroy the firm's standing and the confidence of future clients. Not only would my reputation suffer, but so would that of everyone linked to the firm, including you and my own daughter. An apologetic smile creased his face. I admit to you that at first I was drawn into a few of Percival's schemes, his claims of easy money, invested some of my own savings. Guilt by association would be bad enough, but he threatened to bring me down with him if he faced any legal repercussions. He had receipts and my signature on documents that I would never have signed had I not trusted him so implicitly. At least until I learned not to. I'm ashamed to confess it to you. I know you thought very highly of me at one time, and now I have let you down. But to kill a man? Your friend? As I saw it, he destroyed himself. I would not let him destroy you and Mr. Hunt and Cordelia too. And yourself? Yes, that's just it. It was self-defense. But I had to be careful to not tip my hand. I didn't want Percival to make good on his threat to send evidence against me to the newspapers or Bow Street. So we remained on friendly terms while I awaited my chance and planned the best course. I figured if luck was with me, the servants would think their master had finally drunk himself to death. It's what we all thought would kill him eventually, if some cutthroat didn't do it first. Robert Hardy shook his head. Imagine my surprise when we arrived and learned he'd been struck a blow. I could not account for the scene. Percival with a gun in his hand and a gash to the temple, one I had not delivered. My first thought was that a vengeful moneylender had paid a call. I did not know whether that turn of events was good news or bad. The blow deflected suspicion of poisoning, until you pointed out the signs, but it also dashed my hope that the death would be attributed to natural causes. You poisoned those bottles yourself and then tried to pin the blame on Miss Wilder. Hardy shook his head. I didn't let myself into the house that day with the intention of laying blame at Miss Wilder's door, but when the only 2 bottles I found in the butler's pantry were Belle Island wine, what else was I to do? He didn't care for wine, but I also knew he would drink almost anything if desperate enough, so I did what I came for and left. That's why you seemed so distracted and uneasy when we met that night at the Queen's Head. Was I? I thought I hid it better than that. Or at least, that you attributed my less than jovial mood to your own recent failure. I did think that, yes, at the time. You think too much, Benjamin. Always have. If you had kept quiet about what you suspected, that overworked coroner brother of yours might not have noticed any symptoms of poisoning. Not in a man who regularly poisoned himself with too much drink. But you can't resist saying aloud every thought that comes into your head. Benjamin's hands were damp against the door behind him. His mind whirling, he forced himself to focus on Hardy's face alone. The face of the man who had once been a trusted mentor, but no more. That's why you sent me here. Ben's prideful words to his father came back to sicken him. Mr. Hardy has confidence in me, even if you don't. What a fool he'd been. Yes, I wanted you off the scent. I didn't like the way you were looking at every jot and tittle. I feared you might find something in Percy's office that implicated me. Something a medical man wouldn't notice, but a fellow lawyer might. I wanted to go through his papers alone to find Miss Wilder's letter and any other incriminating evidence. And there was the legitimate mystery of the blow to the head to investigate. Considering the heated arguments between Percy and Miss Wilder, Miss Lawrence, and Mr. Adair, I honestly thought it very likely one of them might have struck him down, not realizing the man was already poisoned. Did you intend to kill Mary Williams too? No. The first sign of remorse sagged his features. That I did not foresee. When I later looked into the pantry and found it bare, I thought perhaps Percy had drunk both bottles, though it was strange that no one knew where the empty bottles were. If the second bottle had still been there, I would have disposed of it safely. It's not my fault the greedy housemaid stole it for herself. Considering the looks she was giving me that night when she said she'd overheard Percy arguing with some man, I thought she might be hinting she had heard something, or perhaps had even seen me leaving the house. I believe she was looking at Mr. Adair. May have been. Those two argued as well. Either way, it was perhaps a fortunate turn of events that she should not be around to testify against me. Benjamin could not believe what he was hearing. Mr. Hardy drew a long inhale and slowly shook his head. Benjamin, why must you always interfere? Things had been going so well. I had decided to stop trying to implicate Miss Wilder. That's why I borrowed your key and removed the rat poison from the cellar and didn't mention it to Officer Riley. Isabel is still reasonably young and has many years ahead of her, as of course do Miss Lawrence and Adair. I am not a heartless man. In fact, I had begun feeling a little guilty about all the angst and danger I was exposing them to. Riley was getting nowhere and never once looked in my direction. I was in the clear. If there was no risk of my being a suspect, then I was willing to let the rest lie. I did notice your apparent change of heart over the last few days with Adair and even Miss Wilder. Hardy nodded. There, you see? But you would go and spoil things. Have you any proof? That letter proves nothing against me. Do I have any solid proof? Benjamin asked himself. No. Robert Hardy's eyes glinted as if reading his mind. That's what I thought. Again he sighed. Ah, Benjamin, if only you were my son-in-law, then I know you wouldn't turn against me like this. Surely you won't make your accusations public without sufficient evidence. Everything in Ben wanted to get off that roof, but if he ran into the house, Hardy would follow, drawing the gun no doubt in his pocket and endangering others. So he swallowed the mounting nausea and asked, And if I do? The theory I'll put forward is that Miss Wilder poisoned the wine, then instructed Miss Lawrence to serve it to Percival and Mr. Adair to strike him, to make sure the deed was done. She did not do so. So she says. But one cannot trust the word of a woman in her mental state. Look, I know you are fond of her, so I will recommend a genteel, private asylum rather than prison or hanging. I won't let you do that, sir. Unfortunately, you won't be here to stop me. Benjamin sent the man a nervous glance. And where will I be? The older man's mouth and eyes turned down in apology. Robert Hardy looked truly remorseful. As much as it hurts me to say, I am very much afraid that you suffered another bout of vertigo while high on the roof of the Wilders' house. He patted the parapet. This really ought to be taller to keep a dizzy person from falling off. Benjamin's stomach dropped, and he began to perspire profusely. Do you really think people will believe that? Yes, I will make sure they do. Sadness creased the older man's countenance. It's not what I want, Ben. You have been like a son to me, the son I never had. But if you turn against me, threaten me, what choice do I have? Benjamin shook his head, heart-thumping. I am not your son. My father is Thomas Booker, who would never hurt anyone for personal gain, a man more worthy of respect than I realized, or than you will ever be. Another flash of pain crossed Hardy's face. Will you give me your word you will say nothing of my involvement in any of this? How can I promise that? I have no desire to hurt you, but you can't ask me to stay silent while an innocent person takes the blame for a murder you committed. Hardy frowned. How bad you make it sound. It is bad. Have you no conscience? Can't afford one. Percy stole that from me as well. Benjamin shook his head, disbelief and betrayal washing over him anew. To think he had taken this man's side over his father's time and time again, held him in higher esteem, distanced himself from a good man in hopes of winning the approval of this man, a self-centered, unrepentant killer. An ill-advised glance toward the balustrade sent a bolt of nerves through his body like an electric shock. Blood pounding in his ears, Benjamin tried to think of a way to talk Hardy out of his plan. He stammered, I thought you cared for me. I looked up to you as my mentor all these years. I did care for you, Ben. I do. I hate having to do this. He drew the gun from his pocket and beckoned Benjamin away from the door. Come here. If you have a compromise to offer me, I am willing to listen. Did Hardy think he would keep his secret, be complicit in his crime to save his own skin? Would he? Benjamin took one shaky step forward, then another, and another. Through the balusters, he glimpsed the veranda far below and felt the earth shift beneath him. Steady. Could he overpower the older man, stunned and dizzy as he was? Unlikely. The door creaked open behind them. From the corner of his eye, he saw Isabel peek out. No. Mr. Booker? She glanced at Mr. Hardy, who had, he noticed, hidden the gun behind his back. Go back inside, Miss Wilder, Benjamin commanded. Mr. Hardy and I are having a disagreement. Nothing to concern you. He did not want to give Hardy any cause to kill Miss Wilder, too. Now that he told Benjamin all, he supposed Hardy felt he had no choice but to guarantee his silence one way or another. But he didn't want the same threat to extend to Isabel. Are you sure you're all right out here? Yes. Leave us. Don't interfere. His voice sounded sharp in his own ears, but at least it was effective. The door slammed shut behind her. Mr. Hardy shook his head, a sardonic gleam in his eye. Now you've gone and hurt her feelings, Ben. You don't fool me. You know, trying to protect the pretty woman again. I warned it would be your downfall. Downfall. Fall. His pulse raced. Nausea soured his mouth. He sent another nervous glance to the hard and unforgiving paving stones below. If he landed on his head, he would probably die. He would be injured no matter what. He saw a flash of movement from the corner of his eye as Hardy charged headfirst like a bull. The sharp impact to his chest knocked the wind from Benjamin's lungs. His feet came out from under him, and the world spun. As he toppled over the rail, he looked wildly about, flailed, reached. He caught the edge of one of the stone balusters and held on for dear life, fingers grappling for purchase, rough stones scraping the skin from his palms. Would Hardy pry his fingers loose? But the man must have thought he'd fallen all the way over, or was he worried? But the man must have thought he'd fallen all the way over, or was he worried he'd been seen pushing him? For he disappeared into the house. Dear God, please don't let him hurt anyone else. Benjamin's hands shook. He was going to fall. The wet baluster began slipping from his grip, but hopefully this way, stretched out to his full 6 feet, and landing feet first, not head first, he would survive the impact. Suddenly a voice called to him from below. Mr. Booker! Oh, merciful heaven! Be careful! He risked a glance over his shoulder. There was Isabel. So much for scaring her off. She dragged over the large cushion from the veranda sofa and folded it double. It's all I could think of. He tried to remember what his father had taught him. How to fall to minimize injury. God help me. Fingers releasing, body falling, air rushing. He hit the cushion and rolled. Even so, with his weight and velocity, the cushion felt like concrete. His ankle buckled, his backside hit hard, and something like a sledgehammer struck his shin. Palms scraping the paving stones, he rolled to a stop. Oh, Mr. Booker, please be all right. He opened his eyes and found her kneeling beside him. His legs throbbed, his hands burned. His spine felt out of place, but her beautiful eyes were on him, so wide, so blue, so full of concern for him. The pain faded. Yeah, right. Are you all right? I'll live. Thank God. Isabel leaned near and whispered, I was so afraid. Her gaze locked with his, then shifted to his mouth. Benjamin's heart beat hard in anticipation. What? She lowered her head and footsteps sounded on the paving stones. Miss Wilder pulled back and he barely resisted the urge to reach out and draw her near again. You just fell, like you're going to be in the mood for kissing. Evan Curtis appeared, without a gun this time. He frowned at the sight of the two of them crumpled on the veranda. What's happened? Mr. Hardy pushed him off the roof. What the? Curtis muttered a curse, then turned and sprinted away. In pursuit? Benjamin was not sure. He returned his gaze to Isabel. Thank you for thinking so quickly. I'm sorry I snapped at you. She took his hand. I was insulted for all of 2 seconds before I realized how out of character it was for you. I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. Mr. Hardy killed Percival, and tried to kill me to keep his secret. She nodded, expression tight. I overheard some of what he said, but never dreamed he'd try to kill you too. She looked around. Where is he now? Benjamin grimaced and levered himself up into a sitting position. I don't know, but we'd better find out. With her help, he struggled to his feet. When he put weight on his right side, his ankle screamed a rebuke. You shouldn't walk on that. It may be broken. He gritted his teeth. I'll worry about that later. Let's block the bridge so he doesn't escape. Does he still have his gun? Good point. You go into the house. What good would that do? You block the bridge, and I will fetch the Curtises and their guns. Hopefully Evan has already gone for his. Knew you were clever. But be careful. If you see Hardy, steer clear. She nodded. And if he points his gun at you? I don't know. But I have to try to stop him. I shall pray for your safety. He pressed her hand, leaned near, and kissed her cheek. Please return the favor. Isabel looked into Benjamin Booker's handsome face, her hand in his, her cheek still warm from his kiss, her stomach fluttering. Would she pray? She had not prayed much in recent years, but her heart was changing. And for this man? She nodded. I will. Turning, she followed the veranda around the side of the house, a prayer already on her lips. Please, God, keep him safe. Help us. Movement caught her eye, and she looked over and saw Mr. Hardy running toward the boathouse, carrying a bag. She called over her shoulder, Benjamin, look! There he is! Mr. Booker limped toward her, wincing in pain with each stride. Leaning heavily on the rail for support, he struggled down the veranda steps. She followed. At that moment, Evan Curtis ran into view, rifle in hand. He raised the barrel to aim. With a loud report, the bullet hit the boathouse over Hardy's head, splinters of wood flying. Stop! Curtis called. That's your only warning! Pulling the handgun from his pocket, Mr. Hardy spun wildly around and lunged behind a tree. Rose came hurrying over from the paddock, a wriggling Ollie in his arms. Found him! Isabel's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to shout a warning as Rose neared Hardy, but he reached out and grabbed her. Isabel cried out. The pup squirmed loose and jumped to the ground. Hardy held Rose in front of him like a shield, arm braced around her shoulders, pistol in his free hand. Don't shoot! He yelled, backing toward the boathouse. Evan, be careful! Isabel called, hurrying to his side. Evan hesitated, then lowered the rifle, cursing under his breath. Mr. Adair ran from the house, no doubt drawn by the gunshot. Seeing his intended trapped by an armed man, he panicked, yanking the rifle from Curtis and swinging it in their direction. Isabel grabbed his arm. Don't! You might hit Rose! Adair grimaced and lowered the gun. What is the madman doing? Trying to escape. Then let him, as long as he lets Rose go. Mr. Booker lurched forward, favoring his injured leg. Isabel caught up with him. Go back, he said. Stay safe. Not this time. She lifted his arm over her shoulder and supported him as he hobbled down the path. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? I don't know. Curtis and Adair followed. As the four of them moved toward the front of the boathouse, Isabel saw its lower level and the pier were submerged beneath the floodwaters. Their old fishing boat had been tied to a tree on higher ground upstream to keep it from floating away. Mr. Grant's work, she knew. Hardy tossed his bag into the stern, then half pushed, half carried Rose into the bow, untied the rope, and leapt in after her. Hurry, Isabel said. We have to stop them. Adair frowned. How? I don't know, but if he takes her to Taplow, we won't be able to catch them. Is that the only boat? Adair asked. Yes. Evan looked around as if for answers. He's risking both of their lives. That small boat isn't safe in such conditions. Mr. Hardy, don't! Isabel shouted. It's too dangerous! Struggling to row against the turbulent current, he either didn't hear her or ignored her. Rose looked terrified. Isabel called to her. Rose! Hang on! The small craft moved away from the shore. 2 feet, 3 feet, 4. The girl she loved like a daughter was moving away from the island, from safety, from her, and Isabel was utterly powerless to help her. Fear for Rose gripped her heart like invisible hands trying to tear it in two. A flash of movement from above jerked Isabel out of her frozen state. She swung her gaze to the upper story of the boathouse and the open loft door. From out of its shadowy mouth, Silas Grant ran, launching himself toward the boat. Hardy turned as Grant hurled toward him, arms outstretched. Hardy fired his gun with a metallic crack. For a moment, the former coachman seemed to float in the air, suspended. Then he barreled into Hardy, knocking him from the stern and toppling both men into the water. Rose shrieked as the boat lurched to the side, threatening to spill her overboard as well. She grabbed the gunwales and held on tight. Isabel sucked in a panicked breath, clutching a hand to her chest and crying out, "She can't swim!" The boat righted, and Rose sat looking wildly around, clearly unsure what to do. Isabel searched the water, fearing any second Hardy would surface and, in his desperation to haul himself back into the boat, either capsize the boat or succeed in reboarding, which would be almost as bad. The current continued to push the small boat farther downriver. Inexperienced as she was, Rose would never be able to fight the swirling flood to make her way back. "Row, Rose!" Isabel called. "Row to Riverton! To shore!" She turned to Mr. Adair. "Christopher, go and help her land the boat. Stay with her in case Hardy comes back." "Right." He ran off to do so. Beside her, Evan and Benjamin searched the surface of the river. Benjamin stripped down to his shirt sleeves, trousers, and braces, then bent and began yanking off his shoes, a groan of pain escaping as he did so. Isabel turned to him. "You don't swim." "I know, but I can't stand here and do nothing. Curtis?" Evan Curtis ran a helpless hand over his face. "I can't swim either." Dr. Grant came loping around the house, medical bag in hand. "What's wrong? I heard gunshots. Adair shouted something about Mr. Hardy as I passed him." Isabel had thought she would never see him again after their falling out, but she wasn't sorry to see him now. She pointed to the boat. "He forced Rose to go with him at gunpoint. Your father jumped in after them and knocked Hardy into the water." The doctor's gaze snapped to the river. "Where are they?" "Neither has surfaced that we've seen." Isabel swallowed a lump of remorse. "Your father may have been shot." Teddy dropped his bag, pulled off his shoes and coat, and ripped off his waistcoat, sending buttons flying. "Where did he go down?" Isabel gestured in front of the boathouse. "Right there, but with the current." They hurried downriver toward the southern tip of the island, scanning the water as they went. A flash of movement caught her eye. Near shore, a man's hand gripped an overhanging willow branch. Mr. Grant's head broke the surface, gasping for air. Isabel pointed, shouting, "There!" The current pulled the branch from his grasp, and he went under. Teddy ran toward the spot and dove in. He swam a few yards, then disappeared beneath the water. Benjamin stepped forward to follow him, but Isabel grabbed his arm. "No, Teddy can swim, and so can his father, if he is able. We don't need anyone else going down. Keep an eye out for Hardy." Change of perspective now. Benjamin nodded, Isabel's firm commands breaking through his panicked confusion. He scanned the surface again, pulse racing, ankle throbbing. If Hardy didn't come up soon, he wouldn't at all. Benjamin searched the Riverton shoreline, then looked toward Taplow. There. A head broke the surface before disappearing again. He watched closely, and seconds later the same head surfaced again briefly. Relief and disappointment wrestled within him. Had Hardy drowned, Benjamin would have grieved his loss, the loss of the man he thought he had known. But this ordeal would be over. Benjamin could tell Hardy's beloved Cordelia that her father had drowned. Perhaps he would not have to reveal what he had done, or at least, not everything. No humiliating trial, no imprisonment, no transportation or hanging to suffer through, to further damage the reputation of the firm, to disillusion his friends and family and scar his daughter forever. But now... Movement in the water nearby interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Grant resurfaced with a ragged inhale that was part desperate breath, part moan. He gripped his father across the chest with one arm and was struggling to stay afloat. He stroked and kicked, eventually managing to draw near the island's point. Despite the pain in his ankle, Benjamin walked into the floodwaters toward them, the water rising to his waist. Captain Curtis followed his lead. Seeing them, the doctor renewed his efforts in their direction. Benjamin stepped in as far as he dared, reaching toward Mr. Grant, whose eyes remained closed through it all. Behind him, Captain Curtis grabbed hold of Ben's braces to keep him from being swept away. He gripped the old man's arm and relieved the weary doctor of his burden. Together, he and Curtis hauled the unresponsive Mr. Grant to shore and hoisted him onto dry ground. Dr. Grant emerged after them, panting and dropping to his knees beside his father. He felt for a pulse. He's alive, but barely. He pulled away his father's shirt, revealing an angry hole, most of the blood washed away and barely flowing. Isabel carried over the discarded medical bag and knelt beside them, her voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Grant, thank you for saving Rose. I should have forgiven you before now. I do forgive you. Do you hear me? I forgive you." The old man's eyelids fluttered open. He looked up at her. Understanding flickered in his gaze, and then he squeezed his eyes shut in apparent relief. A moment later, he breathed his last. The physician's professional facade fell away, and the grieving son laid his hand, then his head on his father's chest and sobbed. Benjamin felt the pain of it through his very soul. "Father, forgive me." Captain Curtis squeezed Dr. Grant's shoulder, and Isabel said softly, "Do you remember telling me your father would do anything to help me? He did. He gave his life to save Rose. I owe him a great debt." Theodore Grant shook his and whispered, "No, but at least he finally paid his." Benjamin turned his face away, giving the old friends privacy for their grief, feeling guilty and out of place, and somehow responsible. He should have guessed earlier, should have sent Hardy away. If Hardy survived, Benjamin would be obligated to pursue him, physically and legally, to make known his wrongdoings, or at least his poisoning of Percival Norris. But could he prove it? Hardy would certainly disavow the confession he'd made on the roof, call it a work of wishful fiction, claim Benjamin was determined to redeem his own reputation and save another beautiful, scheming female. It would not go well. Through a renewed deluge of rain, Ben's gaze traced the river once more. A sailing barge now lurched in the floodwaters. Men leaned over the side, hauling Hardy on board. Enos Redknapp's men? Benjamin shivered. Robert Hardy might end up drowned yet. Not gonna lie, I did not predict that Mr. Hardy did it. But I'm horrible at predicting who done it. What do you guys think? Did you see it coming?